Solomon did not rise to the throne as a confident conqueror ready to command nations, but as a trembling young man standing in the long shadow of his father David, carrying fears he never admitted aloud while the crown pressed against his brow heavier than any sword he had ever lifted in his life. The kingdom expected brilliance from him because he was the son of a legend, yet inside he felt like a child wearing armor that did not fit, and the roar of responsibilities echoed louder than the cheers of the people who believed he was stronger than he truly was. So when he walked to Gibeon with 1,000 burnt offerings and lifted trembling hands toward a silent sky, he was not displaying ritual confidence, he was confessing weakness, whispering that he did not know how to rule, govern, or even stand without God holding his heart together. That night when God appeared and asked him to choose anything his soul desired, power, wealth, longevity, dominance, Solomon surprised heaven because he did not ask for victory over enemies but for a discerning heart, admitting that wisdom mattered more than crowns, armies, or the admiration of nations. In that single moment of humility, God poured out wisdom like a river and added riches, honor, and greatness beyond history. Yet the gift that crowned Solomon with glory would one day reveal the fault lines hidden beneath his self-confidence and the quiet desires his heart was not ready to confront. His wisdom amazed Israel when two desperate women stood before the throne claiming the same fragile child, and the nation held its breath as Solomon called for a sword, not because he loved cruelty, but because he understood that true motherhood reveals itself only when love chooses sacrifice instead of possession. When the real mother begged for the child's life rather than see him die, the court trembled in awe, recognizing that Solomon did not merely possess intelligence but carried divine discernment flowing through a heart that once walked in close surrender to God. Israel understood then that God's wisdom rested upon their king, yet every strength a man carries becomes the place where pride eventually knocks, and the gift that once led Solomon into dependence would slowly turn into a mirror where he admired himself more than the God who gave it. Solomon's greatest dream was not to build his own palace but to raise a house for God, a temple unlike anything ever seen, a place where heaven and earth would meet in stone, gold, worship, and trembling reverence beneath a cloud of divine glory. For 7 years the best craftsmen shaped cedar and stone with such precision that no hammer echoed in the construction site, and every carved cherub, every gold-plated wall, every silent lifted beam testified that this was not ordinary architecture but worship frozen into physical form. When the Ark of the Covenant was carried into the Holy of Holies and Solomon prayed before the gathered nation, his words rose like incense, and God answered not with a whisper but with a cloud so thick and holy that priests collapsed because no man can remain standing when heaven fills the room. This was Israel at its highest point, the day glory sat upon the nation like sunlight on gold, and in that moment Solomon must have believed nothing could fracture the future. Yet glory is never lost through catastrophe first. It fades quietly when gratitude begins to slip away. Gold began pouring into Jerusalem until wealth drowned the streets like a tide, and Solomon's throne shimmered with ivory and lions carved in watchful majesty, while foreign nations spoke his name as if he were more than human, as if wisdom itself had become flesh and sat upon Israel's throne. When the Queen of Sheba arrived with caravans of spices and stones simply to test his intellect, she left breathless because not even half the stories had captured the beauty, order, justice, and brilliance of his kingdom, and she wondered how a man could rule with such effortless authority. But while the world praised Solomon, something inside him quietly shifted, because prosperity that is not anchored to obedience never remains a blessing. It slowly hardens into a gilded cage where a man confuses success with faithfulness and abundance with favor that is no longer present. Solomon turned toward political alliances to secure peace and began marrying daughters of foreign kings, convincing himself that diplomacy required compromise, and each wedding ceremony seemed harmless, logical, necessary. Yet every alliance brought a new altar, a new incense, a new whisper calling his heart away from God. God had already warned Israel that kings must not multiply wives because hearts will stray. Yet wisdom can become dangerous when a man trusts his own judgment more than divine instruction, and Solomon believed he could manage compromise without becoming consumed by it. The palace corridors slowly filled with foreign scents and foreign prayers. Statues placed in quiet corners became symbols of tolerance, and what began as diplomatic courtesy soon grew into unspoken approval as Solomon allowed what he once would have rebuked. He did not abandon the temple, nor stop the sacrifices, nor reject Yahweh. He simply made room for other gods, allowing competition in a place where devotion was meant to remain undivided, and divided worship never looks like rebellion at first, it looks like reason dressed as compassion. Years passed and the drift widened, until Solomon built high places for Ashtoreth, Chemosh, and Molech on the hills overlooking Jerusalem, lifting altars to idols that mocked the holiness of God within sight of the temple that once shook beneath the weight of glory. The same hands that once lifted prayers now raised stones for abominations, and the nation followed his example because what leaders tolerate, people normalize, and soon songs once dedicated to God mixed with chants of shame, blood, and broken worship echoing from idol-lit fires. The temple still gleamed in sunlight, sacrifices still burned, priests still served, yet heaven withdrew its voice from Solomon, not because God abandoned him, but because the king no longer listened, and the silence of God is the loudest judgment a drifting heart can experience. God appeared to Solomon a second time, not in blessing like at Gibeon, but in warning, telling him that if his heart continued to follow other gods, the kingdom would be torn away, and the temple itself would become a monument of ridicule to nations who once marveled at Israel's glory. This warning was not spoken in anger but in grief, like a father pleading with a son who stands at the edge of a cliff. Yet Solomon's heart had grown so entangled in compromise that conviction no longer broke him, and quiet promises to change dissolved beneath the comfort of success. Wisdom, once his greatest gift, had become his idol, and idols always promise control while they slowly drain the soul, leaving a man surrounded by people yet spiritually alone, honored by nations yet empty inside, wearing a crown that no longer carried God's favor. Judgment did not arrive through war or catastrophe but through a prophetic sign when Ahijah tore his cloak into 12 pieces and handed 10 to Jeroboam, announcing that God would rip the kingdom from Solomon's hand, leaving only one tribe for the sake of David and Jerusalem. And as the torn fabric fluttered in the desert wind, Solomon faced the truth he had long refused to see, that compromise never remains hidden forever, and a heart that once walked in glory had slowly become a throne room of divided devotion and silent regret. As Solomon grew older, the weight of his compromises settled into his bones like a slow winter, and the laughter that once filled palace courts sounded hollow, because a man may possess the world yet still lie awake at night haunted by the echo of a voice he stopped obeying long ago. The kingdom still admired him, servants still bowed when he passed, and the gold still glittered like sunlight caught in stone, but beneath the surface Solomon walked like a king with an invisible wound, carrying a loneliness that wisdom could diagnose but could no longer cure. His decisions did not erupt into sudden rebellion, they unfolded quietly through years of small concessions, and now those concessions had grown into mountains, altars standing tall on foreign hills where fires burned offerings that smelled like smoke instead of worship. Whenever Solomon looked toward Jerusalem, the temple still shone in holy beauty, yet in his heart he knew the cloud of glory no longer rested there the way it once did, because God's presence withdraws not in anger but in grief when devotion becomes divided. The nation could still see the outward success of their king, but only Solomon felt the inner emptiness that settled inside him like dust inside a deserted chamber, and he discovered that there is no loneliness greater than losing closeness with the God who once walked beside you. He watched the altars rise higher on the hills, watched smoke curl into the sky like a foreign language written across the horizon, and every flame seemed to whisper the same truth he tried to ignore, that wisdom without obedience becomes decorated emptiness, beautiful on the outside but hollow within. The wives he married for political alliance brought rituals he once swore he would never accept, and every time he remained silent while incense burned, a small part of his devotion stepped further away from the God who had crowned him with grace in his youth. His mind could still produce brilliant answers, his judgment still impressed foreign dignitaries, yet none of that could resurrect the intimacy he had surrendered when he traded surrender for strategy and holiness for diplomacy that demanded quiet compromise. Solomon became a man who remembered God more than he obeyed him, and memories cannot sustain the soul the way presence once did, leaving him wandering through corridors of his palace like a traveler walking through a museum of former glory. Then word came that Jeroboam, once his loyal servant, had received a prophetic promise to rule 10 tribes, and Solomon did not respond with repentance but with fear, as though protecting his throne mattered more than repairing his heart before the God who still waited for him to return. Instead of breaking before the warning, Solomon attempted to silence the threat, pursuing Jeroboam like an enemy rather than seeing him as a sign that God's word was unfolding exactly as he had spoken through the torn cloak on that lonely road. Yet no sword can outrun judgment that was born from disobedience, and no army can defend a heart that has already surrendered to compromise, because loss does not begin with enemies outside the gate, but with fractures inside the soul long before the kingdom begins to crumble. As the years passed, Solomon felt the quiet ache of a man who had pursued wisdom but lost wonder, who built a temple but forgot surrender, who touched glory yet ended his days wandering through the empty rooms of a palace that could no longer comfort him. The songs he once wrote about devotion turned into reflections of regret, lines filled with searching questions rather than burning worship, and the man who once stood in God's presence now wrote about the vanity of everything he had chased, everything he possessed, everything that no longer satisfied him. His writings in old age were not proud proclamations of triumph, but confessions wrapped in poetry, the voice of a king who discovered that wealth becomes meaningless when the soul drifts from the God who breathes purpose into every blessing. Solomon began to understand too late that compromise takes slowly, piece by piece, until the heart no longer recognizes the moment it stopped listening, and wisdom becomes an echo reminding you of everything you once knew but chose not to obey. He looked back on the boy who knelt at Gibeon trembling in humility, and he realized that the strength of those early years did not come from brilliance or strategy but from dependence. The one thing he gradually surrendered as success convinced him he could stand without God's voice. The altars on the hills remained as monuments of every small decision that chipped away at his devotion, and Solomon finally saw that sin rarely arrives as rebellion. It arrives as convenience, logic, tolerance, and diplomacy that slowly rewrites faithfulness into acceptable compromise. Near the end of his life, Solomon wrote not to boast of his achievements but to warn those who would come after him, because he understood that a heart blessed by God can still drift, and prosperity can harden into a prison when obedience no longer anchors the soul. His final reflections were not the words of a triumphant king, but of a man who realized that success without surrender becomes a burden heavier than any crown, and wisdom without reverence becomes a mirror reflecting only emptiness back into the eyes of the one who holds it. He wrote that life under the sun is meaningless when God is no longer the center, that pleasures fade, power decays, wealth evaporates, and every human pursuit collapses into dust when the soul forgets the one who gave breath to every purpose ever dreamed. These were not cold philosophies spoken from pride but confessions carved from regret, the voice of a broken king who wished someone would hear his warning before they repeated his quiet fall, wrapped in comfort and wrapped in success. Solomon understood that his story was not simply about rebellion. It was about drift, about slow decisions that felt harmless, about trusting his wisdom more than God's law until his heart grew numb and heaven's silence became the loudest sound in his life. And in those final days, when the palace felt vast and empty, he discovered a truth that echoed like thunder in his soul, that obedience is not a restriction but a lifeline, and the presence of God is the only treasure that never turns to dust. The man who once made glory fill the temple ended his life searching for meaning, not because God failed him, but because he had slowly walked away from the surrender that once positioned him beneath heaven's favor and beneath the weight of divine companionship. His final confession remains a warning to every generation that follows, whispering that wisdom without obedience becomes a beautifully decorated emptiness, and prosperity without devotion becomes a silent throne where a man sits alone surrounded by everything except the presence that matters most. And so Solomon's life stands not only as a story of greatness, brilliance, and glory, but as a mirror reminding every heart that the greatest danger is not losing blessings. It is losing closeness with God while blessings continue to surround you, until you realize too late that success without surrender leaves the soul undone. Make sure to hit that subscribe button for more interesting stories.